Welcome to Wine Road, the wine, when, and where of Northern Sonoma County. I'm your host, Marcy Gordon, with Beth Costa, Executive Director of the Wine Road.
Thanks to Ron Rubin, we're able to keep our podcast rolling along. The financial support of River Road Family Vineyards and Winery allows us to keep recording, keep sipping wine, and keep sharing stories with our listeners. Check out their website at riverroadvineyards.com and explore their Chardonnay, as well as a finely crafted Pinot Noir from the Russian River Valley. That's riverroadvineyards.com. And hey, thanks, Ron, for allowing us to make this show happen.
Welcome to episode 221. Today we have a really special guest. We have Chris McGilvray, who is the producer and director of the movie Eden, and he is the owner of Nomadic Bear Productions. And we also have our very special guest, Richard Ross, who worked with Chris to do the sound design on the movie Eden, which Beth and I both watched last night, and we're going to recommend it to you as well. But welcome, Chris. Welcome, Richard. We're so excited to talk about this film with you both.
Oh, thank you so much for having us.
Thank you.
I'm thrilled. I'm thrilled because Richard has talked about the film for months while it was in the works, and when it was finally released, it was so very exciting.
We'd get to see little snippets here and there.
Hear things about this or that. So yeah, it really was amazing. I downloaded it, so I watched it on my laptop, and the whole time I kept thinking, I really, really wish this were a big screen that I were seeing it on.
It's such a cool cinematic experience.
Yes, I mean, it was
we've
so
had
beautiful.
a number of screenings, and anybody ever gets the opportunity to be able to see it in the theater, I mean, it is experiential cinema, so it's definitely the best way to see it. But it's also so wonderful seeing it at home too.
Well, I especially appreciated the way your directorial choices. You felt like you're in the frame.
Yes.
The way you're right in there in the vineyard, I felt like I was walking through the vineyard with them. I felt on par. And that's your choice, how you frame that and how you chose that to do that. You're not doing a long shot but it was so, I just felt like I was in the vineyard.
Oh, thank you. It's, that's something that I think I got really interested in early on in my career because I actually studied narrative film. And mostly I actually watch narrative films as opposed to documentaries. And so I'm a huge fan and student of filmic language, which is, literally how you actually utilize all the different elements and techniques that go into filmmaking to be able to express your story and the emotions of the story as well as you can. And when we started making documentaries, which, is now about, 16 years ago, it felt really, immediate to follow the intimacy of characters as they're actually doing action. I love to film myself and my cinematographer, Isaiah Flores, who's worked with me for, 10 years at this point. We absolutely love filming people working in their environment, the detail of the hands, the way that, especially when you're watching someone that is a craftsperson that does the same thing year in and year out over and over, which is so much of what winemaking and vineyard work is.
Right.
There's this unbelievable beauty that I find in watching the way that those hands actually move and interact with the vines.
Right. And the way you shot it was very much a one-to-one experience. What we didn't set up is the name of the movie is Eden, and it is about Mount Eden, a winery in Santa Cruz. And it follows a family of over 7 years and how they're transitioning through the change in as the owners get older and their family, will they take it on, will they won't, and the dynamics of the family and how that all pans out. And so we've neglected to set up what the movie is
and I don't think
about.
we want to say how it all pans out. I think you need to watch the film. But
No, I'm just saying that's what it's about, though.
I thought that was a wonderful summary,
Okay.
actually.
It was a
Thank
great
you.
summary. And I think what I loved watching it is working in the wine business as long as I have. It's very romanticized. And I think that in that film, it really showed the work, the physical and emotional work that goes into making something, like doing the. I just felt like, boy, people, this is an eye opener to watch what this family's going through and how much work it is. And one of the lines was, if you want to be a great winemaker, you need to know how to fix a tractor. And I thought, that's the reality. It's not just all showing up at a wine tasting and pouring your great wine. It's so much work. It was really clear in that film.
Well, thank you. That was something that we set out for from the very beginning, because I think that there is a emphasis, especially on the marketing side, of glamorizing.
Exactly.
Mean, people, and especially when you think of California, one of the biggest contributions that California has made to the wine world is the tasting room. And the tasting room is a beautiful, controlled experience for the consumer to be able to taste this wine in a lovely setting and fall magically in love with it. All of which is awesome. I mean, who doesn't love a good tasting room, right?
You want to see it's fancier and fancier. Now it's an experience, a tasting experience. It's just amazing. Right. Yeah.
Totally. And we were really interested in basically showing the reality of the hard work that goes into this, but also just the complex emotions that happen when you have a generational shift. Mm-hmm. If you are born and raised at a small boutique estate winery, and you literally have experienced a life of having your parents so committed to this product that they spend, ungodly amounts of time focused on it, and maybe a little bit less time, focusing on your needs. How does that translate when you become an adult and start to think about, oh, do I want to take this over at some point? And I think we really go into a lot of those complex feelings that the kids have with whether or not they want to commit their lives to making wine in this way.
Being here in Healdsburg, there's so many small family-run wineries, and most of the kids that I knew all left, and most of them have come back and are in the family business, but they definitely all needed a break. And most of them were not necessarily interested. They years later doing something else came back to the family, and I think that's a natural progression for most of them.
And it's interesting to me how this was so framed. Like we were talking earlier about the bookends. We start with Jeffrey at the fire with his cigar, and we end with Jeffrey at the fire with his cigar. But when you make a documentary film, and you did this for over 7 years, filming with them, you don't know where those cards are going to fall. And it's almost, you're given all this footage, and now you have to create the story.
Make it a story.
You're following the story, but you also have to create a narrative, which isn't easy. It's like, I've got all these cards, and now I have to make a hand. What did it initiate? How did you come to know this family? How did you make this movie? What was the choice? Why did you want to tell this story?
Well, it evolved tremendously over all of those years. And, all the way back in 2014, I didn't really know very much about wine. Basically in our, day job, we make these branded film documentaries for different clients. And we got hired by the Santa Cruz Mountain Wine Growers Association to make a promotional film about the Santa Cruz Mountain wine growers in the Santa Cruz Mountain appellation. And we tracked the vintage 2015 with 4 separate wineries. One of those wineries was Mount Eden. Mm-hmm. And I fell madly in love with it the second I went up there. Most people that ever do get lucky enough to go and visit Mount Eden have a similar experience, because it's, I was born in 1981, and that's actually the same year that Jeffrey Patterson came to Mount Eden, which is kind of a fun little thing. Huh. But it's sort of trapped in time up there. By the time that I started going there in 2015, they didn't have a tasting room. It is a living, breathing, working winery.
Right.
They now do have a tasting room. You can actually come and visit, but it basically is the house that they live in, and they have built a tasting room on the sort of outdoor patio experience. And so it feels like what I imagine visiting a California winery would have felt like in the 70s or potentially the early 80s.
Yeah,
so it's
just
trapped in
come to
time
my
right off the
backyard.
bat,
It's
right?
a very specific place, and that's really illustrated well in the film when you have like an overhead shot
Yeah, the
and
views.
you're showing from the
Amazing.
70s, the 80s, but nothing has changed around it. Like here, it would be all condos, or not here, but most places it would be vast development.
Sure.
But the net effect is still the same, this beauty and this isolation, and up there where I thought that was very interesting. Like the plot grew, the ground grew, but the surrounding neighborhood and the mountains and the topography did not change.
And that's one of the things I think is really interesting about the Santa Cruz Mountains as a wine growing region, is that it's so hard to be able to do the terraforming, to be able to actually plant these vineyards, that they are pretty isolated. And so it's actually a series of very small wineries, which is one of the reasons I think it, sort of goes under the radar, is that if you want to, literally you have, Mount Eden on one ridge, and then the next ridge of the Santa Cruz Mountains is actually Ridge Vineyards. But it's like a 45-minute drive to be able to get between the two, because you have to drive down the mountain, a back road, back up another mountain. It's if you're trying to, hit a couple wineries in the same day, there's only a couple places you can hit more than 3 or 4. And so it's got this isolation to it. And especially because it's over Silicon Valley. So this stuff is actually all on the eastern side of the Santa Cruz Mountains. It's actually about 15, 20 minutes from Apple, from Google, and so it's like you have like all of this technology and the sort of future of humanity under you.
Oh no.
And then you go 1,500 feet up above it, and it's this agrarian, sort of paradise kind of thing. And so I loved that dichotomy. And then, originally you had asked about just the story. It's this was the first time I've ever made a feature-length documentary. Usually, people can afford to pay us for 2-3 days to be able to come out and film. And so you got to tell that entire story in a very, very short period of time. So I was really interested in this idea of the evolution of time. And in particular, Mount Eden wine is really known for its aging profile. That's people that are fans of Mount Eden. One of the things that they absolutely love about it is that a good vintage will age for 20, 30, maybe even 40 years. And so it felt, as we went through this progression and started to, see this family dynamic, and the people are evolving, and the needs of the, family members are all evolving, it felt natural to want to try and continue that study over a period of time, sort of like how a wine evolves in the bottle over time.
Right. Well, I loved how immersive the experience was. And I think a lot of that has to do with the sound and the soundscape. And Richard, because I know you, I was very keyed in.
I know. I was like, oh, this is amazing.
It was so amazing, and how the storytelling and the continuity as each scene began, if you pay attention, the music follows it. It's like each has a theme, and then the sound and how it's overlaid. It was just marvelous. It was so good. I can't say shout out to you, but to know this other aspect of you, but to hear that and how integrated it was and how immersive, it was just fantastic.
Thanks. Now, Chris is very particular about how the sound works in a film. He's really big on sound, which I really appreciate. One of the things he does that's interesting, that's different than other people I do sound work for, is that he likes to lead a scene with a sound that's going to be coming up in the scene, which is, people don't like to do that. I tried doing that for one client, and they said, you've got to do the sound when the scene cuts.
Oh, yeah.
And that's it, But he's always like giving you the idea of what's going to be happening, and then as it fades out, it becomes the next thing. It's kind of like the way the imagery works in the film.
Yeah, I likened it to like a foreshadowing, like a sound foreshadowing. Sure. That's like bridging these scenes, and just to hear like the flop of the grapes into the bucket, the crunch of their feet. It was just so crisp, but so nothing was out of balance. and with the music was fantastic too. The music was so evocative and I just was like blown away by the whole soundscape, truly, with the visuals and how you work together on that. And I was asking Richard earlier, do you give him direction on that? You must have certain things you want, but then you leave it up to the sound designer to do what they see best? How does that work?
So, Richard and I have worked together for, like 16 years, I think. It's really my longest standing professional relationship. And so it's pretty cool. We have kind of a shorthand at this point.
Right. You know what each other are thinking, right?
Symbiotic.
Richard knows my specific sound of wind.
Yes.
My
Say
sound of
example.
I want a medium plus wind.
And it took us years to develop the wind. Like, it literally did. It's like we had to go through so many different wind sounds to be able to be, no, that's actually really the one. Because the thing that's interesting about sound in terms of filmmaking is that it's all about tonality. And
it's emotional.
Yeah, and a lot of people don't think about that piece to it. It's like the key. It's like garlic or something. It's the key, spice that actually gives it all the flavor, but it doesn't necessarily go noticed because
it should be almost not noticed.
It should be.
Yeah.
It should be very subtle.
Yes,
it should be
just
sort
natural.
of in your subconscious.
I think we notice because we know Richard.
Yeah,
sure.
Right.
But it's also it's such that part of the soundscape also created such an emotion and created such a feeling that was so integrated into the whole story that, but I just loved, I was saying to Richard, it's like you're doing Foley, He was like, there's the footsteps, there's the cork. And I recognized a couple of those corks. That was a medium 3 cork.
Out of the sound library.
Yeah, the sound, but it was just, so to have that relationship where you know each other well and be able to add that, what a great working relationship, and that must be so much fun.
It is.
It's really fun. And yeah, I mean, usually like I will start with sort of an idea, maybe show, a couple of film references or clips that I'm interested in. And I think one of the things that we talked about early on with this one is terraforming.
Right.
Because like when I think of a vineyard, it's such an interesting thing. You have to take a naturally occurring environment and then you basically go in and eliminate the natural part of it, but then plant all of this stuff to literally change the earth. And then over the years, the vineyard sort of becomes the natural piece of that earth, and it starts to dictate its own thing. So essentially it's like terraforming. Right. And so I give him like that prompt.
I know.
And then, what do you do?
I get this email, he says, I want it to sound like the earth is, something's growing here. And I'm going like, okay, what sound is that?
I'd have to think on that, yeah.
Like the beginning, I don't know how much we can give away on the film, but the opening sequence of the film was a real challenge because it's a slow-mo.
Yep.
Oh, yeah.
And Chris really wanted to have the feeling of the workers touching the earth and the way it was shot. It's a beautiful scene. The opening's great.
Yeah.
Well, the whole film's great, but the opening is great.
Yeah,
it was a real challenge.
There must be a challenge of slow-mo, how you match the sound to that, that pace. But it always just so, it was so seamless, but it was just so enriching. I really felt like it was, the sound as much of anything was leading me through the film.
Right.
It's meant to. I mean, it's Richard and I really approach sound design as if it really is like its own instrument. It's its own version of film score. And all of my favorite filmmakers really do the same. And a lot of the kind of cinema that I happen to love, and Richard does too, is sort of dreamscape cinema. Mm-hmm. Things that are very much subjective reality. It's not just, it's interpreted reality. And so this film, that's kind of the standpoint that we have. We're always trying to tell the film from an individual character's perspective for an individual sequence. You're sort of in their experience, which I think is part of the reason that you get to start to explore some really cool concepts with sound. Like, when we had the tractor at the beginning, we take a tractor sound and then you have to like heavily manipulate it, right?
It's slow it down and then process it and make it still sound like a tractor, but you don't want it to be obvious that it's a tractor.
Sure. Yeah.
So it's some tricks, but this particular film, has 118 audio tracks.
Oh, my-
Wow.
It's huge.
Wow.
It's one of the biggest projects sound-wise
my
I've ever
gosh.
done.
Yeah.
I mean, that like steak driving, isn't that like 5 different sounds or something all layered together?
I think it's more like 8 or 10.
Yeah.
You see, like, I
Oh, my
can't keep
Lord.
track. That's why.
So
Wow.
how did you make that sound? You out back driving steaks?
No,
or-
sometimes I do record stuff and mix
Yeah.
it in.
Yeah.
But it's just a bunch of different sound elements. Like one was somebody taking an iron pipe against another iron pipe and just going.
Oh, yeah.
Ah.
So that part became
Yeah.
that, and then the other one was an anvil hitting a piece of iron.
Oh,
so
yeah.
bonk is when the thing.
Yeah.
And
I
then
can't do
layering
this
it
now.
all.
Yeah.
Yeah. So but you have to get it so it comes right at the point
Yeah.
of the
Right.
strike and.
Right.
It's funny. It's actually kind of like, basically making your wine, right? Like you're literally taking all the different components
elements.
and
Parts,
blending
yeah.
them together, It's that kind of thing. And then the whole becomes greater than each individual piece.
Yeah. There was one afternoon where I thought I was going to kill him.
Just that one.
Only one?
Just that one? That's not bad.
That's a nice.
Yeah.
It was
Good
that
version.
sound where I could never see, and he goes, "No, it's not quite right." And usually Chris goes,
You're like,
"That's
it's right
perfect."
enough.
It was worth it.
So we were talking earlier about you have a couple little kids
I do.
and what they think of Dad being a filmmaker. So was it a film opening that you were at?
Yeah. So
cute.
we got to, have our premiere at CineQuest, which is a really, really awesome film festival down in San Jose. And it was in a, 1,200 seat, theater that is this, beautiful old, film palace that they've
Nice,
restored, California Theater. And so it was just such a cool experience because, it was a sold out house. And, my kids had seen parts of it but they'd never seen all of it. My daughter's only 8 years old. And so, it's not really, it's much too slow for
Well, yeah, that's not going to be
somebody at her
entertaining.
age.
No.
But my son is 12. And so he definitely, and he is a real, film lover. He's just that kind of person that
Cool.
will sit down and watch, some obscure Russian cinema that I'm,
Oh my gosh.
showing or whatever he doesn't
Right.
mind. And so, yeah, he sat next to me and my daughter fell asleep, which is totally fair.
8, yeah.
And then she actually wakes up close to the end. And then at the end, I'll get up on the stage and do our Q&A. And, she turns to my wife and she's like, why do they keep asking Daddy all these questions? Why does everybody care what he has to say about this film? And she's like, honey, it's his film. He
Daddy's
made
movie.
it. And it's it had never occurred to her.
Well, that's what he does all day.
Yeah, that's what he's actually doing all the
That's
time.
hilarious.
It was
cute.
very funny. And then it was really fun. My son actually got so inspired that he came to me about a week later and wanted to make a film about his school experience. And so
Oh, cool.
we actually did a documentary of his 5th grade experience, with him. And he did all the interviews. He interviewed his teacher and his counselor and his principal and a couple of students. And Richard did the sound on that too.
Oh my gosh.
Which, yeah, it's delightful. It's really cool.
It was nice.
We could even include a link to that. Yeah.
Yeah. We
Called
should.
Time to Grow.
I love it.
It was
well
so
done.
fun getting to inspire my son because he instantly was just like, oh, wow, this is really, really cool. And he started to think about
Well, you can really tell a
how that would
story.
work,
I
right?
mean, that's what film is. Yeah.
Sure.
What are the nuts and bolts of a documentary when you're working with people? Do they have to sign off? How do you agree to what you're showing, what you're not? Do they have any, final cut? I mean, what are the things to...
It's a really, really important question, and really, the ethics of documentary filmmaking is really, really important, right?
Yeah.
And so, with this particular film, I was very, very transparent from the very beginning, sat down with, Jeffrey and Ellie Patterson and the rest of the family, And we talk a lot about sort of the vision of what we're trying to do and make sure that everybody's comfortable with what is going to happen. And then for me, it's very, very important that right up front, we have full creative control. They don't get any creative say. They don't get to, we have final cut, but we showed them the film multiple times throughout the process and discussed the representation, the way that we had used the imagery, the way that we had used the stories, the way that we had used all the all the conversations to make sure that everybody feels that they're well represented and this is truthful. But at the end of the day, we have complete, creative autonomy and the right to do what we need to do. But at the same time, I find it's really important to be able to make sure we're always on the same page and everybody supports what they have. And it's been a really interesting process because it definitely became a much more personal film for them over the course of it. The initial,
where you
idea,
started is not where you ended.
No, we didn't think that we were going to get so deep into the family dynamics and the personal life. But working on this for 7 years, it just naturally evolved that way. And they were 100% comfortable. And I'm so thankful and grateful that they wanted to explore some of those concepts. Like it's wonderful to show this film to winemakers. Winemakers just
they get it.
They get it because it's a
life.
piece of winemaking that a lot of the time isn't really explored.
Right.
I think that's what I loved about it. I just thought this is so honest.
Yeah, it really is. And they're so brave. I mean, it's really...
To put your life out that without
Sure.
any control. It reminded me kind of those early 70s, that PBS, the Loud family, the American family. And you're really exposing yourself.
That's so
And you
funny. My
have to
producer
trust.
talks about that film all the time, and I have still never...
Because you're not old enough.
I've never seen it.
That's
I'm
what
not
I grew
old
up with that. That was like
But I know a lot.
the original cinema verite was the Loud family.
Yeah.
And now we have kind of generations of that. Now we have reality TV,
reality
which is
TV.
But
so
reality
far from
TV
that.
Fake TV.
Well, exactly,
Yeah.
because that's one of the things that I found was really interesting. So, our job is to basically do these for brands. And so they're always branded films, which means that, everybody that is speaking is representing the overarching brand. They're not necessarily the person.
Right.
They're, if it's Jeffrey Patterson, he is Jeffrey Patterson, the winemaker of Mount Eden. And, for the first couple of years, that was naturally what was actually happening in this film, is they're so used to,
they're always on.
presenting and, showing their wine and, talking to people about their product. And it wasn't really until their son, Reed, started to get involved. And there's something amazing about Reed where he just, especially at that point, he was only, 23 years old. And so he was not really thinking about things in terms of being a brand representative. He just was
a person
answering honestly.
Right.
And that very first interview I ever did with him, I'd only met him one other time before. And he just starts opening up about the very complex feelings he has about growing up there and the family dynamics. And that's when we really knew that we started to actually have like a film that was going to be able to become the thing that it ended up being.
That first interview with him, you can tell the whole tone changes because he's almost struggling to really say what he wants. He's very careful, but he's also really setting a tone, and you're like, oh, where's this going? It was so interesting. So you're kind of hooked from that interview on. And then, of course, with Ellie and Jeffrey, we're seeing their dynamic. And then how that really changes through the film too. You don't see these what's coming, but it's you're kind of glued to it.
Sure.
Even if you didn't know anything about wine or don't care about wine, the story is a universal story.
Right.
I mean, that's one of the things I personally am so proud of about this film is that it's not. I wouldn't even really call it a wine film.
No.
Like we use wine as a way of looking at a lot of things I'm really interested in. Family dynamics, family business. I mean, as if family dynamics aren't complicated
right.
enough.
no,
I mean, I have
generational
plenty
passing
of
things on.
wild stuff
Right.
in my family, as we all do. But then actually like having the, business side of it as well. Wow, boy, does that get complicated. All the things that, sort of your Bible, all
Right.
the things that you come up with of this is what our wine means or a winery is or
Right.
whatever. But the other part that's equally as important, maybe even more so, is the people that are actually
it's the
working
story.
there and they embody the brand, whether they believe it or not or whatever. They're, your face-to-face customer side of
That's
it.
what Beth always says. If you come tasting and you get to meet the winemaker,
Yep.
That's what's important.
rare and unusual and a privilege.
It is.
And that's what people, like all our listeners, we interview a lot of winemakers on our show. That's what our podcast is. And we really tried to get into what makes them so interested in wine. Why are they interested and how did they get started? And if people come to the winery, they want to know. I constantly have listeners who say, I went and visited XYZ winery because I heard them on the podcast and they just sounded so cool. And that might not be their favorite wine they had, but they loved hearing about that person and their story and I had worked at a larger winery at one point and they never wanted anything personal told. And I'm like, well, people are here for that. I mean, we want to know that there's people running the show. There's people in charge. It's not just a factory. You're not making widgets.
It's really important.
So it has to be personal. Yeah. Yeah, I loved the film. I'm probably going to watch it again.
I wanted to ask Richard, what was your favorite moment of you created and what was the most challenging? Because there is a lot of challenges, I would think, from the layering and so much things you did to create that soundscape and working with the music and the musical cues and hitting that narrative. What was the most fun and what was the hardest?
The hardest was the opening of the movie. That was
So that's why I want to go back and watch it again. I'm thinking, well, I want to see what was. I mean, I loved it, but I was just drawn into the cigar smoke.
there were so many,
That
so much
crackling
detail.
fire.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's so much detail in the shot,
Yeah.
and then to get the sound to work with
Yeah.
that, and then making the sound effect for the when they're
The-
driving in
the
the
pipe.
posts.
Yeah.
That was pretty challenging,
Right.
and recreating the wire being pulled in the vineyard.
Oh, yeah.
That
Yeah,
and
the
make
part.
it sound like it was going around.
Yeah.
Yeah,
you.
wow.
Right.
My favorite part was there's a sequence where it's a wide shot, pull back, it starts to rain, and then it becomes this little sequence where the rivulets go down to a stream to the river, then they go into the forest. And there's this whole sequence
yeah.
of
Of the water.
as it changed from the water and the sound had to get louder and louder, but it had to morph into the river at the end,
Yeah.
and the rain coming down, and that was a long sequence.
Yeah.
And it was that was my favorite
Yeah.
scene to work on. I really had fun with that one.
Yeah, it was beautiful.
I think that, just because we come here and we talk to you about different projects you're working on, it's made us so keenly aware of sound and everything I watch, every television show, everything. You just take it for granted. I mean, it all sounds right. It sounds natural. You
well,
don't think about it. It's like,
I-
no, someone had to come up with that sound and had to drop it in at the right time. It is
Well, what
amazing.
you really notice is when it's poorly done.
Well, yeah.
it's out of
I mean, that's the
balance.
thing. It's
When
just
the-
not noticeable when it's
It's
perfect.
When
one
the-
of those, yeah.
When they're just, I keep saying, oh my God, they need Richard to equalize this sound because the background's too noisy. You can't hear the voices. Sometimes I have to watch stuff with subtitles
Yeah, I do
because
that a lot now.
the sound mixing is so not well done that it's overblown with the background music or something, and then you have to turn it up to hear the vocals. And so I appreciate good sound design because of you, and I notice when it's bad as
Right.
well.
On a film, and Chris can talk about this, is the whole production from shooting to the
Yes.
end. What people don't even know what the whole
I
production
can't even
sequence
imagine
is.
it.
Sure.
But Chris knows all about
Yeah.
that.
So yeah, I mean, obviously there's a ton of pre-planning to be able to do anything because, you break a film down into 3 different stages. There's pre-production, which is all the planning that happens before the cameras ever appear. There's production, which is when you're actually filming, and then there's post-production. And to me, the most important one is pre-production, because production is always the shortest period of time and the most intense, because it's very, very resource intensive. You have to have a, large size crew. You have all this equipment. You have, you're fighting against the weather and the sun and all these things, and you're trying to capture as many things as possible. And so if you don't know what you're trying to do, you're really, really going to get, sort of behind it. It's like, it's kind of like harvest,
Right.
when you think of winemaking.
Yes.
It's all
prepared.
about the,
Gotta be
planning.
ready.
Yeah, like if your tanks are not ready by the time
too late. Yeah.
you get to harvest, you're busted, right?
Time is money.
And then post-production is the most extensive. It's the one that takes the longest, because that's when you're editing everything. And that's when Richard comes in and becomes involved. And so in a film like this, we have a dedicated production audio person who's there for us the entire time that we're filming. So we are recording sound and all these different elements. And we do both, what is called sync sound, which is, when you're actually walking around the vineyard and actually doing an interview with somebody, and then you have all that sound. And then there's these other things that are called wild tracks. And the wild tracks are literally isolated soundtracks where the production audio is recording all of these things and then categorizing all of it to be able to give to Richard for his sound library that he can now treat them as sound effects and actually
all
layer
his
it back in
spices in
there.
his spice box for.
And so then you give it, to Richard with all of these different elements. And during the editing process, most of it, doesn't have any sound in it at all. It's literally just completely silent other than the actual dialogue. And then Richard gets to come in, and that's when you get to add in all of those different sound elements to really recreate. I mean, like, like talk about how'd you create the, the actual soundscape of Mount Eden, like with the birds and all of that. Like that is a mixture of.
Yeah, multiple tracks. I have a lot of surround three-dimensional spaces, and I have some things like a mountainside with birds and this much distance. I mean, it's that detailed, the sound you get. But so you use it as a base layer to give the space to the scene so that you feel that you're in that area.
Right.
And then you start putting in the little pieces of spice and stuff, and then it just makes it bigger. But I mean, I've actually used some of the actual wild shot and reprocess it and put it back into the movie.
Right.
But one of the things that doesn't get talked about a lot is the hardest part of the post is doing the dialogue editing.
Yeah.
It takes hours because you have to go through and make sure that it's going to be clear.
Yeah.
Or if something has to be replaced or...
And that's one of the things that's interesting. So, when you are watching a movie, like let's imagine you're watching like a really big film, like a Marvel film or something, the Avengers. So that's usually filmed all on a soundstage. And so they make sure that they are going to have perfectly clean audio anytime that they actually have a character say a line of dialogue. Right. If they don't, they actually go back and they do what is called ADR, which is, they literally bring the actors back in and they actually have to say the line again and match the way that they say it to the lips that they actually have. Right. So they have all this money to be able to do all those kind of things, which is wonderful. With documentaries, you by nature have imperfect sound. Right. Because you wish to capture reality.
It's, right. It's
you
real.
Can't, like one of the things that you realize when you do, production all the time, there's airplanes everywhere.
Yeah.
It's like Richard hates airplanes.
Right, I know.
And I don't mind, like, you go to the most beautiful, picturesque vineyard in the mountains, and like there's no, street noise, there's nothing there. Right. Airplanes all the time. And
I'm going to ask a very ignorant question, but when you're editing the film, do you ever have a shot where you've got to move something out of frame, or do you just, like, is there an airplane in the shot and you got to get rid of it?
So, that's a really good question, because from filmmaking, visuals are so easy to be able to control, because if something is not within your frame, it does not exist.
Oh, yeah.
That's why I love Sergio Leone so much. I'm a huge Western guy. And Sergio Leone is the master of playing with the concept that if it's not in the frame, it doesn't exist. You literally have like a character in frame and he's looking and he's doing something. And then all of a sudden, another character pops into that frame. He would have seen him coming from 10 miles away.
Right.
They're in the middle of the desert. It's a Western. You can see him from 10 miles away. But the audience doesn't think about it because it wasn't revealed.
Right.
And so then when you pop in the
funny.
frame, it's like, oh, wow, now you have the showdown. And he does that stuff all the time. It's one of his like big things that he plays
hysterical.
with. And so in filmmaking, to Richard's point, you're like, oh, I really don't like that red barn. Let's move that camera 6 inches to the right.
Right.
It's gone. In audio, you cannot do that.
Right.
Your audio will literally capture every single element. And then I come to Richard and I'm like, dude,
Gotta
I'm
fix
really
this.
sorry. There's this awful air conditioner that goes on and off all the time. Use your wonderful magic to, and your awesome OCD to make it.
It's true.
That's what helps.
It is. Richard is like, he uses that to his advantage, right?
Yeah.
That's why I knew from an early stage I was never going to be able to do my own sound design because I'm not meticulous like that. Like, Richard is saying he has 118 or something tracks in this film. You should see. I mean, think of
I can't
how
even imagine.
organized that has to be, because I'll be like, dude, there is like this one bird that is driving me crazy. And he has to be able to figure out
Find that bird.
which track that is, right?
At what point does the music come in, and what is the direction on the music, and how is that integrated? Are you laying down the soundtrack of the soundscape, or the music first? Which comes first, and how do those blend together?
So that's another really interesting thing. And I mean, we worked closely with our friend, Alex Kelly, who's done a lot of composing for us. So again, Richard and I know him well and have worked together with him a lot. Like, Richard's actually used him. He's a wonderful cellist for a couple of albums that you actually have. And so we have a pretty cool collaboration. And, basically you start with the imagery and, Richard usually cleans up the dialogue so we can get all the levels to the right place. And then we start passing that to Alex. And it's kind of an interesting thing because there's some elements that, there's all this like bleed over of whether that's sound design or whether it's music. Like a lot of the like terraforming stuff that you do naturally adds to the musical track. Like he would, hear that stuff and be like, oh, well, I guess I don't need to, add an electronic element to the score because that, sound design is sort of adding that same thing.
Yeah, he's really good at that.
Yeah, talk about like the tempo kind of stuff and that kind of thing.
Yeah, he'll score the music to go with some of the sound design and the way the footage is working. And then so the tempo of the music is like right with it. And so it just pushes the whole scene forward. It's really amazing.
Because it's all, traditionally you have a locked film that means that there's no more editing that is going to happen. Every image is perfectly in place, and the composer will sit down and at that point actually go through and write all of the music. They've been coming up with sort of the main themes, the melodies and that kind of thing, but they go through and actually, that's why it's called score. The concept is underscore. Underscore the emotional feeling. If you watch old movies, especially from like the 30s, it always tells you how to feel. It's like, oh, you're supposed to laugh here. You're supposed to cry here. You're supposed to do that. And, we've now moved away from that as an art form so that you, now have gotten to the point where you're doing more tonal and interesting things like that.
It becomes part of the narrative.
Exactly.
Yeah, because that's what I was noticing as, we see Jeffrey and then we see Ellie, and then there's a theme of
Yep.
their music, and then
Sure.
at the end of that scene, that music comes to a conclusion, and then it picks up.
Yeah.
And so it's this whole narrative pace that I really noticed and enjoyed, in how that was like, oh yeah, so that's their theme, and then this is their
Sure.
theme, and
Yeah, we worked really hard to be able to come up with themes that connect you to the actual themes of the film. There's a lot of themes in this film.
Yeah.
It's quite complex.
It is.
And so the music is always kind of your guiding point. And the individual characters like Andres, who's the vineyard manager, he's a Latino vineyard manager, and he kind of has his own theme
Right.
that actually comes in. And he plays a really important role in this film. I
Very
absolutely
much.
love
Oh, yeah. No
all
kidding.
of that stuff because
He's the keeper.
he is, man. And it's like,
Yeah.
the vineyard workers, I mean, talk about an underappreciated and represented story that doesn't really get explored a lot in winemaking. He's been there for, 40 years. So
Did you think this was going to be a 7-year project?
no.
Yeah.
Oh, no. It's definitely not. I mean, I started it as sort of a passion project, just as an opportunity to work on something that was a creative project. And I told Richard about this thing for years before I ever got to bring him in because, I was just, filming and editing this thing for years. And it definitely evolved into something much longer than any of us thought was going to be. But the thing that's really nice about that is that it allowed that story to naturally happen. I find
it's
one of the
definitely
things
a
that's
story.
really challenging with documentaries is an ending. Especially, a lot of
Right.
people actually only will make a documentary of somebody that is deceased because
Yeah.
then they can
Right.
choose how to end
or
it.
they
Yeah.
know
right?
the ending they're shooting
Yeah.
for.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's really hard to find
Yeah.
an ending. And a lot of the time, I'm very unsatisfied
Right.
with the ending of documentaries because it's a flawed concept. It's
Right.
like you have to choose an end point this is the start of time and we're negating everything that came before it. And then, there's an ending point and we're negating everything that's going to come after it. And, the story is only the things that came between those two moments. And life obviously doesn't work that way. I mean, the family and everything is continued on after this film. And we naturally found what I think is a really, really satisfactory ending because a, particular storyline came to a natural conclusion and a natural point, which then framed the entire film. That's why you start with Jeffrey Patterson smoking the cigar and end with it. It's a framing device.
Right.
It really kind of,
It's the end caps.
the whole thing is, for me, a experience of him sort of processing his time at Mount Eden and
Definitely.
what his life committing to this winemaking in this particular vineyard has meant, and being the patriarch of this family.
So what are you working on right now?
That's a great question. So, we continue to make a lot of different branded films. We're still doing some work for Ridge Vineyards and we're doing a lot of different cool
Are
things.
those generally 20 minutes or
Those are
or
like
shorter? Even,
they're like
more than ad?
4 to 6 minutes.
Okay, more of an ad. Mm-hmm. Brand.
Yeah, and then they all live on their website and YouTube and that kind of thing.
Right.
We're in the very, very early stages of starting a next feature-length film. We're like super, super early, just kind of gathering concepts. One of the things that I got really interested in this film is very focused on the winery owners and their experience. And, I got really interested in the vineyard workers and in particular.
I was going to ask about that because those are the shots. That's a
Right?
really engaging part of
Right.
Eden is the workers.
Well, and I think I'm really interested in the Mexican American
Their
experience
stories.
and
Yeah.
the immigration experience. So my wife is from Scotland, actually, and so she is an immigrant. Very, very different experience,
Right.
obviously, than a Latin American immigrant, but she moved here when she was, 24 years old, and
wow.
her whole family lives back in Scotland, and she lives here. And so it's a really, that is the story of America. I mean, America is
Yeah.
built on immigrants, but I find this really interesting. In particular, I've done a lot of work in the agriculture industry, and you have a lot of Mexican immigrants and other Latin American immigrants that are working at the farms, but very few of them ever own them. And so, like, I have a, piece that we did with a farmer that, came from Mexico and, was very industrious, worked his way up, and now he actually owns his own farm and is a really powerful and amazing person who's actually paying his workers more than other farms because he's been treated
Right.
poorly
Right.
so many times in his life, and he wants to make sure that the other people don't. And to me, that's really fascinating. And then the other
Good
part
story to tell.
Timely
about
topic.
yeah, right. It's a pretty
Yeah, timely topic. Could you have that out by Monday?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. I wish
Just
I would
get
have
on
had
that.
60. Let's get on that.
Okay, we'll edit that out.
No, we leave it in.
Oh man, it's pretty timely, and I think it's really important to start exploring those stories.
But we should tell people where they can see Eden. It is
Yeah.
on Apple Films. You
Yeah,
can rent
on
or
Apple
buy it
TV,
on
yeah.
Apple TV. Is there anywhere else that it's
So
like
yeah, if you go to edenfilm.info, that is our website, and
Okay.
there's actually links there to be able to see it on all the different platforms. So
Okay.
basically, it's available to rent on VOD. So you can see it on Apple, you can see it on Roku, you can see it on Amazon, Google Plus. I mean, choose your platform.
all the platforms.
All the
Yeah.
platforms. If you wish to rent a film, it's right there. They're actually, you can also buy it on DVD or Blu-ray.
Okay.
Again, that link is right there on our website at edenfilm.info.
Okay.
I mean, we're also going to be doing some screenings throughout the year. So, if you follow us on our website, we are going to post all the different screenings because it
That'd
really
be fun on a big screen.
yeah,
Like
we
a
had
real big screen.
we had a really cool experience down in Pasadena towards the end of last year, where a wine group actually had us come for their private wine group, about 75 people, and they rented a theater, and we
how
actually
fun.
had like Mount Eden wine,
Yeah.
so that
Oh, that's
everybody was
nice.
able to
Yeah.
drink the Mount Eden
Yeah.
wine and
Yeah.
experience the film at the same time. And so
Very
we're working on getting a couple of those more experiential
Mm-hmm.
kind of things, because obviously it's pretty. Amazing to get to taste the wine while you're actually
Boy, no kidding.
watching it.
I love it.
Yeah.
Well, this was super fun.
Yeah.
I
this is
feel like
little
we
bit-
had a celebrity today on
yeah,
the show.
It's fun. It's kind of out of our
We'll get autographs later.
I know.
Out of
Richard
our
is a celebrity.
normal.
It's true.
Yeah.
He's very-
Yeah. So, anyways, people, check it out. Eden the film. If you love wine, you love family dynamics and stories, you're going to love this film, and you should check it
Yeah, I
out.
think it's great. It really gives a different perspective on the wine, making wine, and what's involved.
It's not all rainbows and unicorns.
No,
No, it isn't. But it is always fascinating.
Yes.
And it is beautiful. It is.
It is.
really beautiful.
It is a beautiful. It's a beautiful thing that we need to keep doing. I think wine's more important now than like that. To me, that was always the initial
Yes.
question, and boy, this is always a big one.
Yeah.
But it's, why does wine matter? Like
Yes.
that's supposedly what this is one answer as to what that is about.
Yeah, it's that
why-
continuity, it's the legacy, it's the
Sure.
land, it is important. It's all right there.
I
All
think
right.
that's it. That's wrapping up our show. This
All right.
was awesome.
Thank you so
I
much,
really
Chris.
loved it.
Thank you, Richard, for double duty, our sound engineer and our guest.
Yeah.
And I hope everyone checks out the film. We'll see
Yes,
you on the
definitely.
Wine Road.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me. It was really a pleasure.